módulo incluye 3 conferencias, al igual que ayer, cada una de 20 minutos. Y al finalizar tendremos un espacio con preguntas que pueden ser formuladas a través de nuestro chat, está habilitado en la plataforma. La primera conferencia que tendremos es Innovación en redes de energía para la transición verde, asuntos económicos y lecciones de países pioneros, y esta estará a cargo del doctor Leonardo Meeus. Él es ingeniero en negocios con doctorado en ingeniería eléctrica de la KU Leuven. Actualmente es director del Centro de Energía en la Escuela de Regulación de Florencia de European University Insitute y también es profesor y asociado de Valor Business School. Antes de darle paso al doctor Meeus, les informamos que la siguiente conferencia estará en inglés, así que si desean escuchar el audio original, por favor remítanse, hagan clic en el botón que está arriba de la pantalla, en donde ustedes pueden escoger el idioma original o seguir con la traducción. Bienvenido, doctor, adelante, go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction in Spanish. I think I just understood more or less how you kindly introduced me. I speak Italian, I speak French, so a bit of Spanish I can understand. It's really nice for me to be able to join you. We're still at a time of crisis, but, every crisis has a bit of opportunity. So I think now it's almost normal for me to be able to contribute to your conference in Colombia from home, right? Yesterday I was contributing to a conference in Milan, the day before in Boston. I think this is the new world we are in. I also really thank the organizers to give me some suggestions on the kind of topics I could treat. And they've kindly asked me to say a bit more on what's going on in Europe and what are some of these pioneering innovations that we see in distribution grids in Europe. I thought to just, as I was the first here to talk to you, it's good to give a bit of context to what is going on. We were very happy for the first time we have a female president of the European Commission. And in Europe, the Commission is really the driving force in this whole energy transition because they have to draft and propose new legislation. Ms. von der Leyen, in her political agenda, when she started at the end of 2019, she said, I'm going to, in my first 100 days in office, I will make sure that there is a climate law that will enshrine, as you can see here, the climate neutrality as a target for the whole continent in Europe. So that was the end of 2019. Meanwhile, this climate law has not only been proposed, it has already been adopted. Now we also realize that it's nice to have an ambition with such a far horizon like 2050, but it requires us also to accelerate between now and 2030. And this acceleration is a more recent policy proposal from the Commission, presided by Ursula von der Leyen, and we refer to that as the Fit for 55 package. And I understood Elisa, one of the next speakers, will say a few words about that package. I just wanted to give you this picture because it nicely shows that we expect that to decarbonize our economy, we will rely more on electricity. So that's good news, right, for electricity distribution companies. In Europe today, that you see on the left, about 20% of the final energy demand is electric. So a minority, right? So we still heavily rely on oil, on natural gas, for instance, for heating. And our vision for 2030 and 2050 is that this will increase a lot. So on the top graph, you see that the total energy demand will go down a bit for 2030, but even more for 2050. But below, you see that despite this overall reduction of energy consumption, electricity is really going to increase a lot, up to 50% of the total energy. And that's a lot, right? Especially if you translate that to what's going on in distribution grids. And here, a very first study was published earlier this year, connecting the dots, where we see a kind of 10-year network development plan, investment plan for distribution grids. And we are used to have about 23 billion a year in terms of investment in distribution grids in Europe. And this will accelerate to about 34, 39 billion. This is the view of the industry, of course. And now I think we will have a debate with other stakeholders that will maybe even challenge these numbers, or maybe I think these numbers are also already somewhat underestimating maybe the need for investment, because this study was published before we had the Fit for 55 package. Then on the right, you see why we think investments are increasing. Well, you might have heard, I think in California, the E.DSO published this kind of duck curve. I sometimes say the duck from California migrated to Europe, because we now also think that the profile of a typical residential consumer will become increasingly challenging, with a big peak in the evening. When people return home from work, they put on the lights. In the winter, they put on the heating. In the summer, maybe the air conditioning. So then you will have a high peak. And this high peak of consumption will coincide with a very low production of PV, right? Because we do think that more and more consumers will have their own PV installations, but they won't necessarily produce in the evening when they need it the most. And then the question is, how will we, invest in grids or invest in other technologies to deal with this new type of profile? Then I was even yesterday in Elisa with the same event among European DSO, where the European DSOs were saying, looking at this picture, we need to be proactive, we need to invest, we cannot wait. But even though that is true, we already see that grids cannot follow. And this is a picture from the Netherlands, where the amount of PV connected to distribution grids and the amount of new loads, new consumers, in the case of the Netherlands, this has been a lot of data centers that all of a sudden wanted to connect to distribution grids, was of such a nature and unexpected, both by the regulator and the company, that it created congestion. So on the left, you see congestion for consumption, and on the right, you see congestion for production connected to distribution grids. And this picture was even all over the general media in the Netherlands, all over the news, because we are not used to that in Europe. We are used to distribution grids that have sometimes even been, with overcapacity, but definitely not with undercapacity. When I show this picture in Belgium, for instance, where I'm currently living, we cannot believe that this could ever happen, but it's happening. And not only in the Netherlands, we've also seen something like this already in the UK, in Germany, and in other places. So that's a new reality. And then we are already talking about how to deal with this reality. Because what do you do if you are a DSO and you cannot connect your customers anymore because your grid is congested? Well, option A is to tell them, please wait until I have done some more investments and then I can connect you. Or, and that's being discussed currently in the Netherlands, the regulator is suggesting that maybe they can continue to connect people, but when they then have congestion, that they would procure services from the same people connected to their grids to help solve this congestion, so that the DSO is becoming, like an active manager of the grid based on services procured from their own customers. Another model that you can do when you have congestion has been tested in France and the UK, where new people asking for a connection are being offered options. In the UK, they're being told either you wait until we have done more investments and then we can connect you and we can give you a firm connection, or you accept a non-firm connection, where if we have a critical situation in the grid, we can actually curtail you, and then you can already get a connection right now. In the case of France, this kind of non-firm connections have been offered on a voluntary basis, with compensation. So then you are offering your customers two options. You're saying, if you are okay to be curtailed once in a while, we offer you a discount on the connection cost. And even further is option D. And option D, as far as I know, has only been currently implemented in Germany, in Europe, is to say, no, everyone becomes non-firm. So even if you had a connection and you thought it was firm, all of a sudden it's non-firm and you can become curtailed. But in the case of Germany, it is at full compensation. So if renewables connected to distribution grids are curtailed, and they can be up to 3% of their volume on an annual basis in Germany, they get the full compensation for that. And compensation means the lost revenues from subsidies related to renewables. So that's where we are in Europe. So you can see that we do not have yet a full solution, but we are in a new reality, testing new regulatory approaches to these challenges that might occur, I think, also elsewhere. I also said that DSOs started to procure services, and here are two examples from these kind of tenders, right? So already in 2019 in the UK, the DSOs, you see two DSOs there, UKPN and the Scottish Power DSO, and they have worked with PICLO, and PICLO is actually a new type of market operator that is specializing in helping DSOs procuring flexibility. And you see also the volume of these tenders has been increasing over the years. Another approach has been followed in the Netherlands, where the TSO, TenneT, and the DSOs, including Liander here, have started to collaborate, and they jointly procure services. And they do that through an interface called GOPAX. And what they do is they don't procure capacity, as in the case of PICLO. So PICLO works with 3-year contracts, grid services, right, to be flexibility are 3-year contracts. But in the case of the Netherlands, they wait until 1 day before delivery at the intraday stage of trading, and they anticipate if they will have congestion, and then they do counter trading. So they actually trade in the market to solve congestion. And this kind of tenders for flexibility, we refer to them as flexibility markets in Europe. And as I said, some operators are specializing in this new type of market, like PICLO, but also Nodes and GOPAX. You also have companies like Enel and Enedis that are front runners in setting up this kind of market. These more commercial initiatives you see on the left here in my slide. On the right, you also see a lot of European research projects and not pure academic projects. Many of these projects include demos from DSOs. These are all the members of Elisa's association. So maybe she will say a few words more. I'm also involved in some of these projects as an academic. You can look them up. You see the logos, and they also have websites. But a lot of that research is still ongoing. So you do not yet find the final results of these demos. Why are we doing that? Every time I talk about this topic, there is at least some people still skeptical. Like, why would you even use flexibility in distribution grids? Why don't you just build distribution grids to the capacity they need to handle all the peaks? Well, this has been one of the studies that was rather influential in Europe. It's a study already from 2014, where for the first time in Germany, the case was made to really allow curtailment of wind and solar during critical moments. And as you can see in this graph, that study claimed that if you would allow, for instance, to curtail up to 3%, you could save up to 40% of the investments, right? And these kind of studies, I think, started a debate in Europe on having the possibility for DSOs to do this. This was ex ante. Now ex post, we are doing this in reality, and you start to see the first impact studies that appear. And so far, what I have seen is that people are relatively positive about the potential to save grid investments. The last two slides come to more specific topics that the organizers asked me also to treat. One was how to give financial incentives for network innovation. And this has been quite a struggle in Europe because we used to regulate TSOs and DSOs often focused on efficiency gains, right? Then regulation also evolved to include proxies of quality, often technical quality, and more recently, we've started to talk about how to include innovation within the regulatory incentives given to monopolies. And that's definitely not easy. And in that chapter, you see there on the right, we have this table that just gives you a flavor of what we have tried. In principle, you could allow innovation to be part of a regulatory asset base, right? So that's, of course, giving strong incentives to a DSO to do innovation, because then innovation becomes like investments on which they can earn a rate of return. Another approach which has, for instance, been followed in Italy is that for certain investments like smart meters, a different weighted average cost of capital was applied, so like a premium, right, to invest in this kind of technologies. Other regulators have simply asked DSOs to make an innovation roadmap, like a bunch of projects, and then these costs were simply passed through to consumers. So they were put out of the incentive scheme. Allowing DSOs to, for instance, spend 1 or 2% of their budget on innovation. Other regulators have said, no, we don't feel comfortable to have to manage this innovation part. So better to create a new agency, a new kind of setup where DSOs can compete with others for grants. And this is an approach that, for instance, has been followed in the UK, where there is a big innovation fund, and DSOs also team up with other, with other parties to get part of that fund. You could also say that that is the approach we follow at European level with all these consortia that I showed you. These are competitive tenders where E.DSO and others also participate. This is on the input side. So you can say, let's make sure that DSOs have enough money to invest in innovation. But there is also another way of dealing with innovation, and that is more output-based, that you reward certain outputs that DSOs can get if they do innovation. One approach that I know of in the UK was at some point, the DSOs, if they were able to connect more renewables, they could get a bonus. And because at that time, a few years back, connecting renewables at distribution level was still a rather new thing. And that was then a KPI that was added to the reward and penalty scheme of these DSOs. Another output can be customer satisfaction. If customers are satisfied, that often also means that some innovation is going on. Then I also wanted to share with you a rather recent phenomenon in Europe. In Europe, regulators have more and more realized that the transition is going so fast that we have to accept that regulation is always going to be, one step behind the changes. And at the same time, that's normal because you cannot expect the regulators to already change everything when they're not yet sure how to change the rules. But at the same time, we also don't want regulation to be a block, a constraint for innovation. So a sandbox is basically a way of dealing with that, because a sandbox, and we've had different versions of these sandboxes in, as you can see, Italy, Netherlands, and the UK, basically is the regulator or the ministry that says, look, we know that some innovation requires changes to the rules, but we're not ready to change the rules for everyone. So case by case, you can come to us and you can ask exceptions to the rules. And we will grant it to you, to your project, if we think we can learn something from this project. And this, for instance, in the Netherlands, has allowed communities to do community projects that were not yet foreseen in legislation. And this then eventually helped the Netherlands to develop new legislation for specific energy communities. In Europe, energy communities means these kind of cooperatives where citizens get together and organize themselves to maybe jointly invest in a wind farm or in a PV installation that is bigger than what you would do as a private individual. Now, maybe in the interest of time, I won't explain you all the details of these different implementations of regulatory sandboxes. The only thing I want to tell you is that these 3 countries have been pioneers. but they follow the different approach. So I think different context can require a different approach. Just to give you a flavor of the differences, in Italy, it was very much driven by the regulator. So the regulator said, we want to have these kind of experiments, and we want to learn from these experiments. In the UK, it was the opposite. The regulator said, we do not know what type of innovation we necessarily want to promote, but we allow projects to come forward, and we will check case by case if we can give you an exception to the rules. Just to give you an idea what kind of exceptions in the UK, some people wanted to organize supply locally, but they didn't want to have the burden of having to apply for a supplier license, which is not always easy, especially if you're just a small community trying to do an innovative project. So then they granted a kind of light supplier license, for instance. In the Netherlands, they did something in between, because they made a menu of options. So they said, we know that these articles in the legislation can sometimes be a burden for innovation. So of these articles, you can ask an exception. And it was also the ministry managing that process rather than the regulator. That meant that it was easier to grant exceptions, but then sometimes the regulator was in a position of having to manage the consequences. If it is driven by the regulator, like Italy or UK, I think the regulator is more closely involved, so that's good. But the regulator does not always have the mandate to be able to give the exceptions, right? So then the regulator is a bit a go in between the ministry and these projects. After this initial implementation of regulatory sandboxes, these countries also evolved. They learned from experience, and they made some adaptation to their sandbox. For instance, in the Netherlands, it's now also possible for DSOs to propose new projects, because in the first generation of sandboxes in the Netherlands, it was mainly for communities and homeowner associations, and DSOs could not propose projects themselves. But now DSOs are proposing, for instance, experiments with different distribution tariffs, because in Europe, we're having a lot of discussion on how to change the charging methodologies we use in distribution networks, but to change that for the whole country is sometimes a big decision. And that's why to test it in a certain environment within a sandbox is actually quite appealing. Just to give you some latest insights from one of these European research projects, and this is work in progress, it has not yet been published, but we saw that these three countries here have been quite an inspiration for other countries to also implement regulatory sandboxes, and we have them now also in Belgium, in Austria, in France. So it seems that these sandboxes are spreading in Europe. I also, with this final slide, wanted to say that, yes, they are an opportunity, right? But I also don't want to be blind that there are some risks associated with these sandboxes. We know from experience that sometimes regulators have the impression that the project promoters asking for exceptions to the rules are maybe sometimes asking to get, subsidies, rather than real requests for innovation. Regulators are sometimes also put in the position to have to consult because maybe these innovators do not always understand regulation and they think they need an exception, but actually they don't. That's also the experience of some regulators. And of course, one risk in theory is that these sandboxes are used as an excuse not to change the rules, right? The default regulatory framework. And that is, of course, also something we do not want. But for the moment, I think we're rather positive, more than negative about these sandboxes in Europe. And that's it. If you want to know more about some of these topics, the book on the left, the green one, is a free book, open source. So if you look it up, you can read more on many of the topics that I just presented. And I look forward also to the Q&A session later and listening to my colleagues here in the panel. Thank you.
Gracias al doctor Meeus. Continuemos entonces con el doctor Juan Benavides, con la conferencia El valor económico de los recursos energéticos distribuidos DER en las redes de distribución. El doctor Benavides es ingeniero eléctrico de la Universidad de los Andes, es especialista en gestión de sistemas energéticos de esta misma universidad y especialista en matemáticas avanzadas y doctor en economía mineral de Pennsylvania State University. Actualmente él es investigador asociado de Fedesarrollo. Damos entonces la bienvenida al doctor Benavides. Adelante.
Muchas gracias por la invitación. Mi tema es discutir el valor económico de los recursos económicos descentralizados. Y tengo 6 puntos para discutir de manera rápida. Primero, la definición para ponernos de acuerdo y el potencial de las tecnologías 5G en telecomunicaciones que están fusionándose cada vez más rápidamente, integrándose con la tecnología eléctrica. Luego, el concepto de conectividad inteligente, el papel de las ciudades inteligentes en energía, el cambio de modelos de negocio, las necesidades de investigación y desarrollo y un par de preguntas que yo mismo me hago y respondo. Definición. Estos recursos son los recursos energéticos descentralizados, son recursos flexibles que se conectan a las redes de bajo voltaje que producen energía o manejan la demanda. Todos ustedes ya lo saben, pero me gusta que nos pongamos de acuerdo en lo que estamos hablando. Esto incluye pues un montón de artefactos y tecnologías como techos, pequeñas plantas de diésel, almacenamiento en baterías, vehículos eléctricos que pueden devolver a la red en algunos momentos en que el precio y la demanda son oportunos. Calentamiento pasivo o no pasivo en edificios y artefactos inteligentes que se pueden conectar y desconectar a discreción. Entonces no voy a hacer la lista completa, pero ya esto era simplemente para ponernos de acuerdo.
When I speak with other industries, you know that electricity is the vanguard of the digital innovation. Control instrumentation always have been present in the power and electronic, in the new operative environment. There is a variable supply, there is an expression of what is the distributed load and the added resources, the complexity of the loads entering into the system require a change, a different way of thinking. The decentralized resource, according to Elexon, give services to the system, frequencies, quality of the wave, etc. And the consumers, whether it's aggregating and controlling the resources or a better coupling of the local demand and production. This is the graph of Elexon where is brief explain in the columns the activities that they can do, the services that can be provided, the values of the system and the values of the users. I'm going to share this with you so you can see it in detail. A first value chain appears when some necessities are solved and those resources are monetized. The second channel, it depends on the capacity of these resources to be monetized in real time in the trading of excedents or the procurement of specific demands. I've worked these topics alongside with Gabriela Elizondo from World Bank, and we found that there is a new generation of intelligent networks that can take advantage of the 5G technologies that have low latencies to respond to our necessities and can give support to some auto-healing or self-healing of the problems that can be emerged from the grid because now are bigger. They can appear or disappear in loading times. The localization of failures and the processing in the cloud of big data amount. The automation in the hands of the users can reduce the expenses, improve the welfare, and reduce eventually the CO2 emissions. The benefits of the 5G technologies are in 4 categories in colors. First is the utility optimization. If you invest in a smart grid 2.0 that was promoted on behalf of the companies up to 5 years ago, providing some new income sources. And in countries like Africa, the electrical grids have entered into the business of the wide band on isolated places where the networks cannot get the cell phone networks. The second category of the benefit is enabling of those resources capture value and promote some changes in business models. You have heard the aggregators, the power virtual plants, and a profound disintermediation, because that brings important problems of revenue of the networks and also quality and continuity of the service. We can promote also on a market architecture that is new. What is trending now is a working deployment on layers. An operator of the system is in transmission and dispatch, and some others of the distribution have some coordinations of. And at last, the fourth category in the context of the decentralized resources is the one that allows the management of services in the city, very coordinated, as the coordination of the transportation, the electricity, and the heating sector when it's required in the industry or domestic. This is a discussion of the 3 kinds. These are the slices in which 5G can have an influence eventually when handling decentralized resources. EMBB, the mobile wideband, MMTC, communications between machines, and ultra reliable and low latency communications. So you can have here a chart of how these taxonomies of 5G can be entered within the use cases, within distribution. On the right side, you have the slice types where we can have use of this technology. In the middle, you have energy use case and the taxonomy of benefit of those technologies according to the use. What it says by Elexon, that is in the first column. The route guide of the renewable decentralized resources we have here in this graph, depending on the density of the resources, decentralized resources. So as long as there is more density of adoption of the decentralized systems and the devices, we are going to require a market architecture that is going to be more robust, more complex, intelligent connectivity. This is said by Huawei and Oxford Economics about the digital spillover, those externalities of the network that speed up the knowledge, the performance improvement in a company. And in the horizontal meanings, the supply chain in the vertical or among the industries. So this is important because not only in the electrical sector, but all sectors, biggest innovation is given in the telecom and within the same sectors. But the electrical sector is one sector is avant-garde in the application of the digital technologies. Here we discuss the 3 channels of the digital spillovers, and the countings cannot capture the externalities. And in the study of the Oxford makes some approaches, finding that the economical contribution of a dollar in digitalization is around 2.5 times the direct impact. This is calculated with some sort of econometric technologies that can capture better the external effects of those spillovers within the industry and the value chain. Examples of these three channels of energy. In the internal part of the firm, you can process a lot of that data, processing software operation that can be used for commercial purpose. In the horizontal channels, the demonstration effects as showing the positive effects required. This has not a clear cost-benefit rate, and one virtual plant or aggregator may introduce vertical channels between the aggregation plant for the end users in regards to invest in flexible devices and every time more intelligent. The same study says that in these coming 10 years, the digital transformation is going to go to the offer side, and the transition of the industries and the firms required to adopt a complementary packet of technologies that are here. 5G of telecommunication, using of a lot of big data, IA, connectivity inter-machines by the use of IoT. Those are the connectivity package that are required. In Colombia, the connectivity, the intelligent connectivity is inexistent. We use it for Netflix. But now, getting into the end, a smart energy city, this is an idea, a semi-utopic with not concrete results in Europe, but it could make more sense with when we have the IoT more developed business models, the ecosystem of entrepreneurs or cities that want to be every time more clean. So there is the opportunity to enter into this, but we require incentives as the ones that Leonardo discussed, regulatory sandbox. We also may apply crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, and make some alliances between the distribution and transportation systems to finance the electrical loading. I have some simple examples of what can be done with financial modelings or APPs. This is a structured example of what may set up in smart city in regards to energy. There are some dominiums that are the hardware and the built environment, the offices, the districts, transportation and mobility, the infrastructure of communication and energy, and the soft domains that is in the part of collaboration, business models, etc. And on the right side, we have some objectives and collaborations. So implement these and new ways of collaboration with new incentives is a very interesting challenge in which the distribution firms can have an important role. This requires also an intelligent grid, sustaining the physical and commercial operations. This is a model of smart grid that I mentioned before. When you have in the lower part, in the y-axis, you have the generation, transmission, distribution, the distributed resources, and the consumers. Then we have the different zones, and in the vertical, we have different layers of interoperability. So the smart grid was now evolving. It's not only a sort of scattering asteroids, but now is the layer able to sustain new model of business. And it comes a new discussion if in a first stage we can facilitate E.DSO could be able to be an entity with positions in the business that can be important to have a critical mass, but also has to have some carings of non-discrimination with the end users. This is the classical graph of the task distributions between a system operator and a DSO, in which eventually there is an aggregator as an alternative. We can discuss if can be part initially and then go along with the distribution operator with all the problems that they may face. Now, the change in business models, there was a plant. This is the example of Nemox. That is an application of Next. It's a BPP in Germany offering the service of virtual power plant without investing in development of software. You can experience it. The artificial intelligence is being more into the energetic efficiency that it was before, the rational use of energy. Now, the companies, even the French company that is installing in Colombia to handle the energetic efficiency, are using artificial intelligence, not only going to the authority to say, no, you have to change your boiler because it's very old. This is smarter and measures the daily loading and by trading, and also can foresee the capex investments, being able to have an intelligent operation. So the IA is a resource that is very important for this. This is an example of a company that is BPOXX in Rwanda, based in Europe, that is working in 10 countries in Africa, installing individual solutions to some villages, very poor. And this is a funny example because you see here that the installations of individual solar panels are followed in lines. And it's because they are next to the distribution network that is very bad. So here they take the opportunity to make a bilateral trading among their neighbors. So the irony is to have a network that works as a business platform for a distributed business. Research and development, to finish, you may think that it's important to develop in distribution, research and development to be able to have intervention of costs in the emissions to meet the NDC. The green part below the negative cost means positive benefits for a private firm. That is important to be done, and this research and development can decrease the curve, the slope of the curve. So now every time more the business in red can go to green. Now another objective is to develop an industry of electronic of power distribution and control in Latin America, to the deployment every time faster and increment the decentralized resources. And the third objective is to fund an energy lab of simulation of energy of decentralized resources, as is done by the NREL in the US, in order to have a better system and performance and commercial performance in different approaches and business models. So that is the presentation. I would like to show those resources are important, the decentralized one. The role of the decentralized resources is similar to the role of the risk capital in finance. The risk capital is never going to be the most important. It's not going to be the key component of the profit in the economy, but they leverage and shows where things should go forward to. And if we don't promote it in Colombia, these resources can be done in a way that everybody can benefit, all the stakeholders. 3 questions and 3 answers. Can these decentralized resources have a disruptive effect on the operation in the business models and the distributors and the market architecture? Yeah, but as I told you, the disruption is a function of the size of the portion of the market of these decentralized markets. After a certain threshold of density on the networks, it's useless that the operator want to handle a bunch of individual transactions in low levels of voltage. Those models of decentralized resources are intensive in knowledge. This is made by entrepreneurs, not electrical engineers, that they study something different. The only alternative, the viable alternative for the distribution from now on is to have a partnership, be intelligent, and share the profits for the system and the consumers. And any attempt to block these resources is going to fail. The other question is, can these resources give benefits? Under which conditions? Yes, they are going to give benefits, but we're required to have a smart grid, a smart measurement system. This is polemic, but I believe in the prices, not to install bigger power plants, but to guide small investments of this kind and include the role of the aggregator plants. The other is that it's required to give a compensation, a reasonable one, to the grid in order to be efficient. So in 3 or 4 years, they wrote about binomial fees to having an important portion of the opportunity cost of the alternative, of the more efficient alternative to give continuity to the service. This way, with this scheme and the regulatory sandboxes, you may find different alternatives in which they can cooperate the distribution networks and decentralized resources. And the evaluation of these resources involve that we need to have adjustment costs and coordination issues to solve in order to get a critical mass and have a simultaneous evolving between the resources, the aggregators, and including also the phases in which are emerging the distribution operators. And the last question is, these resources are going to end the distribution networks forever and they are going to take the part in there? No, the DSO and ESO needs to play different roles, but complementary, coexisting in the power generation resources that are not centralized. As I show in the box example in Africa, you may require, if you have exceedance, the way to handle is through the grid. The scale economy in grid services and backup are going to prevail under a huge decrease of costs in decentralized resources, and in the future it will be integrated. Thank you. That was my presentation. I guess I have to stop sharing my presentation. Is that right?
Correcto, doctor Benavides, muchas gracias.
Can you hear me now? Okay, perfect. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here. And thank you so much also to the two previous speakers that have given incredibly insightful presentations. I'm Elisa Anderson, Technical and Projects Officer from E.DSO, the European Distribution System Operator Association. The objective of my presentation is to very, very briefly introduce E.DSO and then present 2 points that are very much in line with Leonardo's presentation, that are the crucial role that the DSOs are going to have in meeting the European climate objectives, and also the need for great reinforcements now and in the near future to meet these objectives. E.DSO is the European largest DSO association, a number of kilometers of distribution lines, and also a number of consumers. The figures are on the screen. We have members in most European countries, like Iberdrola Distribución, Energa, E.DSO, E.DSO, etc. E.DSO has 4 main objectives. The first one is, of course, to properly represent the DSOs and be their trusted voice. Second of all is to be to portray the message of the key role they're going to have both as neutral market facilitators and enablers of the energy transition. Third of all is to not only promote but also actively contribute to the research and innovation projects. We are currently participating in 6 H2020 projects, like the one Leonardo showed in his presentation, Universal, and we're also participating in the proposals for the new European funding, Horizon Europe. And the fourth objective is to be the link between the energy system and the consumers and the citizens, and that is an objective that we don't take lightly. So not that long ago, the electricity system looked a lot like this, very much linear. However, now the system looks much, much more like this, with the distribution system in the middle. DSOs are responsible for smoothly integrating distributed renewable energy sources. They're also the link and the managers of the interaction with the prosumers that need to change their behavior and should be able to change their behavior without any restrictions from the distribution grid. And just to give another example, they are also the link with the EV charging infrastructure, that it's also connected at distribution levels, and they have to manage this increasing load also very much smoothly and without any restrictions. With this slide, I want to compare the energy system with the transport system and illustrate the huge paradigm change. In the image to the left, we see a road full of carts pulled by horses and just one single car. And the image to the right is that exact same street 13 years later, that is full of cars and circled in red, just one cart pulled by horses. And what I'm trying to show here is not that the huge change we've already experienced and that I've shown in the last 2 slides, but the huge change that we're experiencing at the moment and that we'll continue to experience in the near future. And what this means is that issues that before we used to have quite a long time to tackle and that were perceived as issues for the long term are actually now with the climate crisis problems of today and that need to be tackled immediately. So what will we discuss today? I'm going to briefly explain the European regulatory context in order for that to give a foundation to explain the crucial role that the DSO is going to have in order to meet the very ambitious climate objectives, do a call for action that is related to the need for grid reinforcements if we want to meet that climate objective. Then I'm going to give a real case example of one of our members, Iberdrola Distribución, related to the transport sector and the heating sector. And finally, the key highlights and conclusions. So the regulatory context, as Leonardo has already touched upon, the European Green Deal is the legislative proposal to have the EU be climate neutral by 2050. However, to achieve that, we have to start working immediately. So this summer, the Fit for 55 was presented with the objective to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030 with respect to 1990s levels. This Fit for 55 meant the adaptation of a series of policies like the three that are on the screen. E.DSO in October, so very recently, published a response to the Fit for 55, analyzing the E.DSO perspectives of the three policies on the screen plus the EU ETS system. Starting from the first one, the adaptation of the Energy Directive was very much welcomed by DSOs as it increased climate ambitions, and it also included the energy efficiency first principle. However, it is thought that it could have a bigger and a more holistic view of what energy efficiency means, tackling, including, of course, a focus on network losses, but also a broader focus of, for example, the operational losses. And as Juan Benavides has shown, really smartifying the grid in order to very much minimize the energy lost. Of course, in doing this, DSOs are going to have a central role in having an energy efficient system. Secondly, the Renewable Energy Directive. Of course, once again, the adaptation of the Renewable Energy Directive was very much embraced by DSOs. It also increases the ambition, and it very much highlights the need for electrification of the different sectors if the climate targets are to be met and achieved. Of course, the DSO will have an essential role as distributed energy resources and also flexibility assets are going to be mostly connected to the distribution grid. And also DSOs will manage this interaction both with prosumers and with flexibility service providers. In order to manage this interaction, smart meters are absolutely necessary, and it goes without saying that the digitalization of the grid is partly dependent on the rollout of smart meters. Thirdly, the alternative fuel infrastructure. The DSOs embrace this proposal as they are responsible for the stability of the distribution grid, and with this responsibility comes the responsibility of doing proper grid planning and very much in-depth assessments of the flexibility needs that they have. In this regard, further along in my presentation, I will explain how Iberdrola Distribución has done that, because it is thought that there should be, of course, in this legislation, a focus on connectivity and be able to connect the EV fleets. However, there also should be a big focus on capacity and making sure that the DSOs have enough capacity to deal with these new loads. And I hope that with this overview of the regulatory context, the essential role of the DSO in order to meet these ambitious climate targets has become absolutely apparent. this key role that is twofold, both as a neutral market facilitator, dealing with flexibility aspects, flexibility service providers, and as an enabler for the system integration, enabling the integration of electric transport, like I've already mentioned, but also, for example, the building stock. However, to make sure that the DSOs can indeed fulfill this very important role, there's something that is very, very much needed. That is, of course, DSO grid reinforcements. So here comes one of the big messages that I'll also repeat in the conclusions, that there is a pressing need for the regulatory framework to allow for this grid reinforcement and the implementation of the grid planning. There are many drivers for these grid reinforcements. Some of them are shown on the screen. The figure comes from the Deloitte study, Connecting the Dots. First of all, I like to touch upon the one on modernization. It's undeniable that the distribution grid at the moment is aging, and that there is a pressing need, first of all, to ensure that the DSO grid has enough capacity to assimilate all of these new loads that are being connected, but also that it's digitalized and has proper smart metering. Second of all, with the year we've had, I cannot ignore the point on resilience. We've had huge wildfires in, for example, Greece that have affected the overhead lines. We've also had floods, very big floods in, for example, Germany that have also affected distribution grids. Therefore, there's a pressing need to reinforce the grid to make sure it's resilient to the even more extreme weather conditions we're having. Lastly, of course, the electrification of immobility. I've already mentioned the role of the DSO in integrating EVs. And that is why I have chosen an example that has to do with electrification of transport. This graph shows that transport is the sector that is going to have a largest increase in demand of electricity, as it's the circle at the left side of the screen. And in order to assess the needs of grid reinforcements, Iberdrola Distribución did a very much an in-depth, detailed study of the grid reinforcements needs in Spain. So the inputs of this study were the increase in demand from now until 2030, so quite short term, of EVs with and without smart charging, and also heat pumps with also different levels of flexibility. This input was put into a very powerful simulation tool that simulated the low voltage network, but it also simulated the secondary substations. And some of the output is what you can see on your screen. The model showed the overloads that would happen in the medium to low voltage networks, also in the medium to low transformers, and the voltage drops. On the image to the left, you can see the overloads in the transformers that were mostly in Madrid, Bilbao, Valencia, and Murcia in the case of Spain. And in the image to the right, you can see an example of a congested low voltage network in the Madrid area. So this was done by Iberdrola Distribución in order to have grid planning ahead of the problem, and also to make sure there's a strategic investment planning, as this investment can be done affordably and without affecting the consumer if it's done ahead of time. So for a big message, I chose a big image, also a bit of a quirky image. In Spain, we have this expression that means, well, that is, no puedes empezar a construir la casa por el tejado. That literally means you cannot start building the house with the roof. You need to start with the foundation. And my message here is that there is a need to have the regulatory framework prepared with, for example, regulatory sandboxes before to have the foundation prepared, and also the proper grid planning from DSOs to then build the walls and the roof that then can be the large-scale implementation of EVs, distributed energy resources, flexibility assets, etc. So this is explained in words. First of all, is this need of the regulatory framework to allow the DSOs to very much fulfill this essential role they have to meet climate targets. That is first enabling system integration of, for example, EVs, electrification of transport, the building stock, heating, and then be able to be the neutral market facilitators. And then with the last slide, I just want to highlight again the point number one, that is the need of the regulatory framework, and to go back to the point I made at the start of the urgency, and that it's a problem that needs to be tackled now as the energy system moves really, really fast. Thank you very much. That was all from my side, and I'm open to questions in the Q&A section.
Generation products and make sure that the network is really prepared to connect this new generation. The tiers have no generation distributed plans as well, but they have more the role of making sure of the operation, the stability, and being able to connect this generation, distributed generation.
Yeah, I can just confirm what Elisa said. We have unbundling rules in Europe, and we have tried to separate the monopoly activities, the grid activities, from market activities. But there are still several companies that within a holding company have two subsidiaries, right? One is active in distribution and the other can still be active in other activities. So there is no ownership unbundling, right? They can still be part of the same holding, but they are regulated as separate companies.
Architecture in the E.DSO.
Sí, en la presentación solo enuncié de manera cualitativa que tiene que ver con la densidad. El umbral de densidad es un problema de costo-beneficio y de riesgos. Entonces, se tendría que hacer un análisis completo.
Complete analysis in what time of density, and what kind of artifacts are the ones that activate or engage the transition towards red that has no operator DSO to a network that has a DSO operator. It depends on several things of if there is or no aggregators, if there are, it's very important, if there are an intelligent or smart grid, so there are certain of condition, a part of density that need to be fulfilled to make sense and have value to a distribution operator.
Doctor Benavides. Bueno, aquí tenemos
Thanks.
otra pregunta, está formulada para el doctor Leonardo. La pregunta
It's a nice question, but not an easy one, because I tried to be careful in saying I think the Dutch scheme or the UK scheme or the Italian scheme works best, because I think they have pro and cons. So I would not tell you to copy one of them. I would really think about what you want to achieve with the regulatory sandbox, and in function of that, choose what you want. I feel that all the other countries that have started, they're all trying to find their own way. For instance, I was recently talking to the Belgian authorities that are still quite new to sandbox. And in Belgium, for instance, the first cycle of sandboxes has not been a huge success because all the stakeholders were concerned about giving exceptions to the rules to one project. So the first project that was awarded under the regulatory sandbox was basically almost giving no exception. So to my feeling, regulatory sandboxes is also about taking a bit of risk, right? But you're taking risk within a box. So you're not changing the rules for everybody, but you're changing the rules for one or two projects. But you should be willing to do something. I mean, if I take the Belgian example, I was challenging the authorities saying like, okay, if that is what the sandbox is about, it's not going to have a big impact. So, but still, it turns out to be quite sensitive to give exceptions to the rules. So also, I feel that there needs to be a gradual learning process and communication also, because I think there are often misunderstandings in Belgium, for instance. In the beginning, everybody thought that the sandbox had no rules at all. Like you just do whatever you want, and that's of course also not the idea. It's about, I think innovators should also not be lazy and to say we just want to do whatever we want. They should really justify, right, why they need exceptions to the rules. And I think another aspect that we have learned is that there should be some rules on how transparent the innovators have to be. Because if the innovators get exceptions to the rules, maybe that should then also imply that they have to be somewhat transparent about the experience they had, because if you are treated exceptionally, you maybe should not also keep all the information for yourself, and that's something that has not been addressed, I think, in every sandbox in Europe. I think the Italian example is quite clear, where the regulator from the beginning said, we want you to have public reporting about the experiences within the sandbox, which I thought was also quite nice to include as part of the rules. Another thing I can say is the length of the sandbox. In the UK, for instance, in the beginning, they gave a lot of exceptions to the rules, but only for 2 years. But 2 years is really not enough. In the Netherlands, they started with 10 years. Maybe 10 years for some projects is even too generous. So I would say within those two extremes, probably it makes sense, right? The duration for these projects to work with is an important factor we have learned.
Of the network. How long can this process take? which are the priority actions or measures to be taken? Thank you very much for the question. It's a very good question in regards to the grid digitalization. Now, how long may take, it depends of up to what extent we want to digitalize the network. I think that we cannot step on the brakes of innovation. It means it can last all we want. The most important aspects of digitalization, as I said in the previous presentation, the rollout of smart meters is essential to have this communication with the consumers, the distributed generation, etc. The European perspective, we are a lot of countries, and there are some countries that are more advanced than us, and they have smart meters of 4G, and some other countries that are less advanced in this process, in which we need to thrust to digitalize their net. Aside from the smart meters, there are smart grids,